The Great Reset is just around the corner. What does it look like? What is the role of Klaus Schwab? How does China factor into everything and the BRICS? Lots and lots to talk about, lots to consider as well. And I've invited a fantastic guest for that. It's Andy Schectman of Miles Franklin, owner and founder. And Andy, it's been great to see you in Vancouver. And it's great that you're making the time again today. It's good to see you, my friend.
Kai, thank you, brother. It's great to be back. Sorry we didn't get a chance to connect the way that I had hoped in Vancouver. We were kind of passing ships in the night, but good to see you for briefly and good to be back. Thanks for having me.
Oh, for sure. You're the author of one of our most successful videos here on our channel. Had to have you back. Like, there is no doubt about that.
Great to be here.
But Andy, you brought up Vancouver. Why don't we start there for a second? Because it was busy. It was hectic. I was there for 4 days. I was out in and out of meetings the whole time. There was really, really good energy there. Just recap the first couple minutes here. Your impression of the conference and what was your motivation to go?
Well, I thought that the conference in and of itself was fantastic. You had a crowd of people that I think were there for the right reasons. A lot of times when I look at the new entrants into this marketplace over the last year or two, largely due to silver squeeze, let's say, that I think some of the people who came into this market um, perhaps came in for the wrong reasons. We're looking at buying precious metals in the same vein as GameStop and AMC and looking to capitalize on making a profit for precious metals. And I don't think that's the reason to own precious metals. I'm keenly aware of the price action. You're going to be lying if I said otherwise. But to me, precious metals are wealth that have outlived two world wars and German hyperinflation and the Great Depression and every pandemic. And to me, gold and silver represent a bedrock, a foundation, if you will, of your portfolio. Buying them and looking at them as a vehicle to get wealthy on, I think, is a mistake and leads to, especially if you've been in this game long enough, the volatility, the counterintuitive action in an asset that is the mirror image of the Western system, an asset that will be fought tooth and nail by the Western leaders to not let it fully accentuate itself and especially attack it in counterintuitive ways, leads to a great deal of disappointment if you are buying this to make a profit the way that you would GameStop, the way that you would AMC, the way that you would cryptocurrencies, the way that you would anything. You do not buy precious metals for short-term appreciation. You buy them and you put them away and you hope you never need to use them. And if you do, you're damn glad you have it, whether it be an opportunity or an emergency. And if not, you pass them on to your kids. What I'm getting at is that I think the people at the show were there for the right reasons. They understand that something is afoot, that something just isn't quite right. And looking at gold and silver as a hedge to everything else that we have in our portfolio and a hedge to the craziness that we see around us, to me, is the place to start. Looking at it as wealth rather than as an investment is the proper way to look at this. And I do believe that the people at the show have that in mind, and it was refreshing. There was a vibrance at the show that gave me, I think, confidence that we're seeing a larger groundswell of people who understand the importance of precious metals. And I think I'm very grateful for the silver squeeze inflection or the infusion of interest that it provided. But I think there's been a good deal of disappointment from that crowd, who I think came in looking at gold and silver, I don't think from the proper angle or through the proper lens. And maybe that's changing a little bit. So as far as why I went there, you had some of the best and brightest minds in the industry, and I felt it was an honor to be asked to speak there. Jay Martin puts on a hell of a show, and the people there, from Rick Rule to Robert Kiyosaki, yourself, and everyone in between, were just people that I like to associate with. For me, being at these shows is less about doing any form of business and more about being seen and being included with the people who I believe understand what's going on and can help us all get to where we need to be with great information and great insight.
Oh, that's absolutely the topic for our conversation. Great information, great insights. We're going to talk about that because we're going to turn this conversation into a two-part series. Part one, we're going to discuss sort of the fundamentals of what is happening in the world right now, leading to a financial great reset. Like, we can't deny it anymore. It is happening. It is being discussed even in mainstream media to a degree if you pay close attention. So we need to talk about that, the de-dollarization and the effects of that. Right.
For sure.
Part two, I want to talk more about like why to own gold or how to own gold and silver, and sort of how to prepare for that effect for what we're going to discuss first, and sort of like how do you position yourself. That's going to be part two of
Right
our
on.
conversation, Andy. But let's dive right in because you were hosted a workshop and you were part of a panel. Part one of our discussion is going to focus more on the content of your workshop, meaning leading up to the Great Reset. Again, lots and lots happening. BRICS,
Yeah.
things moving east. And
Yes.
the de-dollarization, obviously. You threw an interesting question out there. I think it was on your first or second slide. Is like, what makes the U.S. dollar the world reserve currency? Right.
Right.
That gave me some thought actually to ask you about like what happened in history when we saw a change in world reserve currency, meaning going back before the U.S. dollar was sort of nominated as world reserve currency. Talking about the switch from the French franc, to the British pound, and then from the pound to U.S. dollar. Like, I want to spend a couple minutes on that, discussing like what were the ramifications, what happened, and what did the common folk experience back in the day when that change happened. Let's start there because I think it's really valuable to understand that.
Well, I'm not as in depth a student of history as perhaps I should be, but you can go back to the 1400s and you'll see that there have been several world reserve currencies that typically have a length anywhere from 40 to 100 years, and you arguably the U.S. dollar is at the end of its rope in terms of its time period, but it typically would go from a period of of dominance in the world sphere to a waning of power. And when you look at how we shifted after two world wars in Europe, it just made sense to go from the pound sterling to the U.S. dollar. The West had won the war. It was hadn't been ravaged by two world wars, and it was across the ocean. It was a safe place to be. It was I think the obvious place, the obvious choice. And what made it work was not the fact that they won the war. What made it work was the fact that we had promised the rest of the world when we took over for the pound sterling in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire meeting of the Allies. We promised the world that the dollars that they would hold would be redeemable for gold at a rate of $35 an ounce. And so I guess you get to a point where promises didn't really matter. The fact that it was backed by something. And I think, history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And you could make the argument that's the direction we are heading in right now, because when you have the ability to have a governor, if you will, backing the currency creation, the ability for governments to not recklessly inflate their currencies because it's tethered to something like gold, the fact that these countries, in fact, felt safe enough to send us their gold across the Atlantic Ocean because they felt it was safer being held in the United States. They would take the $35 we would pay them per ounce for their gold and reinvest it back in the U.S. into treasuries, giving their gold holdings a return. A non-interest bearing asset all of a sudden gave a return by us holding their gold, investing the proceeds in treasuries, and knowing that they could always exchange their dollars back for $35 an ounce. This was the confidence that gave the system its integrity. And this is also what I talk about when I look to the BRICS nations or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Here, if you look closely and listen closely, they're talking about, in the case of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a new settlement currency pegged to gold that will settle transactions throughout the whole Eurasian continent. We hear that the BRICS nations will have a currency that will be a reserve currency that will be pegged to commodities. here again, it doesn't always repeat, but it rhymes. And after, all of these years, really since 1971, of a currency being backed by nothing other than the petro status, but not tethered to gold or an asset that puts a brake on money creation. I think this is really where we are going, and what gives the whole system confidence is the ability to restrain, if you will, the desire by politicians to do what they've always done, and that is to choose the printing press over austerity, over the tough decisions. So, what gave the confidence to the world in 1942, or I think it was 42 or 44, 44, I think actually. What gave the confidence to the world in 1944 was the fact that not only had the U.S. won the war and was the about to be the engine of prosperity and growth and safety and everything the world wanted or inspired to be, they didn't have to rely on the promise of a politician. And it was backed by something solid, tethered to it with the ability to redeem it at a fixed rate. And that is what made the system work. And I think that really is the lesson to take away from it, is that we can't rely upon the promises of politicians. Rather, we want something concrete that will not only prohibit politicians from following this same old narrative that goes all the way back to Roman times, inflation over austerity, but something that actually, in the case of the dollar back then, and I don't know will go this way now, was redeemable if they so required or demanded. And that really is what gave the system its integrity until 1971, when it all broke.
And you're referring to the decoupling from the gold standard, obviously back then. I want to talk like it feels like there's a process happening already where everything is shifting eastwards, meaning the BRICS are discussing their own currency. It feels like we're in again progress or process that can't be stopped anymore because the U.S. has printed too much. The the money supply has been increased to levels that are just astronomical, and the U.S. lost credibility worldwide, and maybe weaponizing the SWIFT system as well has pushed things into the lap of Russia and China and their currency, right? And Saudi Arabia to a factor as well. Do you see a scenario where the world or the U.S. could step up again to protect the world reserve status and become credible again? Is there a scenario in your mind?
I was asked this question at the show, and fortunately, there was a paper that had just been published by the International Monetary Fund that made me look at things a little bit differently. One of the things that caught my eye in 2020 and in the height of this shift that I was noticing towards the BRICS nations was the International Monetary Fund, coincidentally, was formulated at Bretton Woods. The International Monetary Fund is somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 countries from around the world that comprise this International Monetary Fund. It was formulated at Bretton Woods. In 2020, they came out with a report. It's on their website saying, we want a new Bretton Woods. They want a new dollar system is in essence what they were saying. There was a report that they just published, and I'm going to paraphrase it, the title of it, I'll get it real close. It said something to the extent of gold as an international reserve, a barbarous relic, no more. And, if we go back to the majority of my career, when people would talk about the fact that the dollar had overstayed its welcome in terms of its world reserve status, oftentimes, people in this industry, myself included, have a bad habit of being very early, kind of like the little boy who cries wolf, remembering at the end of the story, the wolf does come. But people have been talking about the demise of the dollar for a very long time. And many of the assumptions centered around something called special drawing rights that would rise up and take the place of the dollar issued by the International Monetary Fund. All of this conglomerate of these countries all pooling together to make something called a special drawings right. Well, that would just be another fiat currency as well. But it was interesting to me to see the IMF publish this report with the context of gold being no longer a barbarous relic and an international reserve. Now, if we go back to 2019, when gold was reclassified as a high quality liquid asset or a tier one reserve, which gave it a new level of integrity from tier three to tier one, meaning it's a riskless asset. And when you see all of the central banks massively accumulating it, just like we saw here in 2022, where more central banks have accumulated it than in any time in the last 55 years, it becomes very plausible. When I was asked that question, I thought about it and I said, yes, maybe if the IMF, with the US included, issue a special drawing rights pegged to gold and beat the BRICS nations to the punch, that would be the only way that I could see them not losing such a tremendous amount of market share in world reserve. Because quite frankly, what we have is a system right now that is, you look at the US dollar, which is the world reserve currency, makes no sense if you think about it. We are $130 trillion in debt, 31 trillion of it on balance sheet, over 100 off balance sheet, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, government and military pensions. I think we've overstayed our welcome and we're insolvent. So when you talk about the fact that the US is the world reserve currency and weaponizing of the dollar, as you mentioned, that was really kind of, I think, the impetus for these countries to speed up the progression of finding a backdoor, finding an alternative. And that is really what we are seeing. And I often ask myself, not only what makes the dollar the world reserve currency, so few people know that it is the protection of the Saudi kingdom. You go back to 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. It was 3 years later that Henry Kissinger struck a deal with the Saudis and said, we'll protect you, we'll provide you military support, but for that, you and OPEC will denominate oil globally in dollars. And it's been that way for 50 years. And you can see this progression that is happening, not just in the fact that we are seeing Saudi Arabia being protected by Russia, joining the BRICS, admitting to the world that China is their most important trading partner in oil this year and for the next 50. But we were just told in Davos that they're open to accepting other currencies for oil. That's all hugely important. But when you see the weaponizing of the dollar as the world reserve currency, saying you can use it, but you can't because I don't like what you did, there is a perception globally, I believe, of hypocrisy, that the West can choose who they want and do what they want. And if you're on the wrong side of that equation, well, you're going to be sanctioned. Looking what the European Union did, taking it a step further, the funds that they sanctioned from Russia, they have now confiscated and are using to rebuild the Ukraine. Well, this is a problem if you are the rest of the world, because, part of what makes, the United States so great is the ability to not agree with your government or not agree with everything, have a free opinion, free speech. Well, in a global sense, we're kind of hypocritical in that respect, because if countries, we don't agree with what the countries are doing, we sanction them. There was a French bank a few years ago that was trading with Iran, even though Iran was sanctioned by the West. This French bank decided to do business with them, and we sanctioned them to the tune of like $4 billion, or threatened to kick them out of SWIFT. This is the type of bullying that I believe has incentivized the world to find alternatives. And to your point, the weaponizing of the dollar, and I often ask myself, Kai, is this intended or not intended? Now, this gets a little deviation from what you asked me, but I want people to think about it. Our leaders are not dumb. They may be nefarious, but they're not dumb. And you have to ask yourself, if you weaponize the dollar and as the controller of the world reserve currency and tell someone they can't use it, I don't believe in that. It should be for world opinion, right? And if you do that, what are the consequences, intended or unintended? And I think to not realize this, I think is naive. You have to understand that this is going to, I think, freak the world out, saying, are we next? And incentivize them to find a back door. So while there is a chance, perhaps, to rectify this situation, at least in a sense, I think we've also lost a good deal of faith and confidence and trust as the arbiter of the world reserve, for the way that we have behaved, the actions that we have taken. And when you talk about is it intended or not, you have $130 trillion in debt, right? And all of it accumulated, most of it at the lowest interest rates in human history. Most of it will never be able to be paid off. So just like calling inflation Putin's fault, which ignores the fact that in the 3.5 years that preceding today, the US has printed more money than in the history of the country before it, that's inflation. Inflation is not distortions of the supply chain. That adds to it. Inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. It is an increase of the money supply. That is what we did. It is our fault that inflation happened. It is our fault we mismanaged the currency. Putin's a scapegoat. But if you weaponize the dollar, knowing full well that there will be consequences, is it intended or not? Is it intended in the respect that we need to find a scapegoat to reset the system? Because, someone who I respect and miss every single day, I guess you call him a mentor of mine, Richard Russell, a decade, 15, 20 years ago, was saying the Fed has no choice but to inflate or die, talking about the mountain of debt that was accumulated back then. And now in 2017, we were at 17 trillion. Here we are at 31 trillion, not even counting the unfunded liabilities. It's growing exponentially. There's no way out without inflation or default. So was weaponizing the dollar and incentivizing everyone to move against us an intended maneuver to find a scapegoat? It was Russia, it was Xi Jinping, it was OPEC and Saudi Arabia. They did it to us. They ruined the American way of life. Let's rally behind that. Forget about the fact that the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury really screwed the pooch through money creation and suppression of interest rates. And I just want people to think about that sometimes things aren't always as they seem. And if you are this, if you're the US, you have to realize at some point you've crossed the Rubicon, the point of no return, when you're sitting on 130 trillion in debt with interest rates rising. So pick a villain or fall on the sword. And I don't know what the right answer is to that. But Kai, I'll tell you, as the Chinese curse goes, we are living in incredibly interesting times. And I really do believe, after being in this industry for over 30 years, that there is a fine line between conspiracy and reality. And unfortunately, I feel that this line is a little bit blurred right now as to what the real answer is. So either our politicians are naive or they're diabolical. I don't know which one it is, but somewhere in between there is probably the truth.
You brought up conspiracy. Now my mind is going to another question I wrote down, but I wanted to go take the conversation in another way because I wrote down what is the role of Klaus Schwab in all of this? And I'm trying to figure that out. The World Economic Forum, what side does he stand on, and what does he have to gain? What's his motivation?
I don't know what his motivation is, other than starting all over and being part of the system, being part of the controlling system. But when he made that comment in 2019 or whatnot, I thought he was an idiot. But think about it. With all of the money that was pumped into the system over the last several years, with keeping interest rates immeasurably and artificially low and it being controlled by the bankers and not by the market, you created an environment where through corporate buybacks, through hedge funds being able to borrow money at 1% or less and plow it into the markets, making huge bonuses, enriching themselves through corporate buybacks, through hedge funds being able to buy these investments in real estate and stocks and crypto and bonds and pump it all up and make huge returns. We created distortions and misallocations. In Austrian economics, perhaps they call this the crack up boom, where you have all of these distortions and these misallocations that create impossibility in price discovery, where everyone's assets have gone parabolic. If you have assets, they've gone parabolic over the last several years. So we're starting way up here, right? As a response to the pandemic or the plandemic. I mean, wherever your mind goes on this, some people say it was planned and this was the reaction to it, to jack sky high asset prices up and then crash the system. The Great Reset would be the fact that the world dumps dollars simultaneously, whether you call it Operation Sandman, that Mike Adams talks about it, or whether you talk about it the way that I do, where OPEC and Saudi Arabia say, thanks for the memories. We've got our ducks in a row. We've joined BRICS. We have made alliances with Russia and China. We have said we are going to open up currency or oil sales in other currencies. And when they're all ready to go, and if you look, you got all 13 producing OPEC producing countries on the Belt Road Initiative. You have 7 of the 13 OPEC countries have already either applied or said they're going to apply or already are in the BRICS nations. Most of them, if not all of them, are in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. You put all these groups together, you're at 85% of human population. And now you have a formidable set of allies, both militarily and GDP, that can stand up to the West. And if bang, they say, hey, thanks, been a good run, but we're going to take other currencies. Maybe, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization professes to issue a new currency shortly, backed by gold as a settlement currency for the Eurasian continent. Or maybe it's the BRICS currency. We were told it will be pegged to a basket of commodities. Or maybe it's the Petro Yuan bond, or maybe it's just the ruble, the rupee, the Petro Yuan, and whatever else. And everyone will immediately sell dollars. They've all had to own dollars, every country, since 1974 to buy oil. What if that's not the case anymore? And the dollar gets dumped, creating a tsunami of inflation that hits our shores. And the response to that is interest rates that spike to compensate for the massive loss of purchasing power in an inflated currency. Remember, there's many times more dollars outside the US than there are inside the US because every country's had to own them to own dollars. And prior to the petrodollar, it was the world reserve currency. Everyone had dollars to begin with. So going all the way back to the early 40s, you've got everyone in the world holding dollars, whether it be because it was pegged to gold or whether it was because it was the petrodollar. They're everywhere. And if all of a sudden you don't need to own dollars anymore, there will be a rush selling. Now, Operation Sandman that Mike Adams talks about is a coordination where all of these countries have signed on to an agreement where they will all dump dollars at once. And this is exactly how it would happen if OPEC made this agreement. If OPEC and Saudi Arabia, all 13 countries on the Belt Road Initiative, most of them with BRICS and the Shanghai Corporation, they feel comfortable enough where they won't be messed with the way that Iraq and Libya were after they made declarations of not selling their oil for dollars. We have a group that is formidable and will be able to stand up. And if they all, bang, dump them at once, there's your great reset, because stocks, bonds, and real estate have been elevated to levels that are unrealistic based upon suppression of interest rates and a massive infusion of money, which pushed asset prices up to a level that is distorted and is not right. And when rates rise, you will find asset prices try and find equilibrium with those high interest rates. But if it happens all at once and the dollar is dumped, the dollar drops, loses its value precipitously, rates skyrocket, and the 3 pillars of wealth in this country, stocks, bonds, and real estate, all simultaneously collapse. Those 4 pillars, dollars, stocks, bonds, real estate, all inversely correlated in this case, or at least the 3 are, to a rise in interest rates, is the Great Reset, where everything simultaneously collapses at once. And it's not so impossible to see this happening when you take a look and see the pieces that are being put into place. A couple of years ago, people, when I was talking about this before anyone else, people thought I was crazy. But the fact that it's happening, the speed at which it's happening is really concerning me, because I saw these pieces being put into place by looking closely with little bits of information here every few weeks or every few months. And now it's every single day. There's a new article that speaks to de-dollarization, that speaks to unions being made between countries in settlement, in energy, in military support. And it's all happening, and it's all void of the Western participation. So I think it is 100% within reason to let your mind wander and think of this Great Reset. And, I don't think it's too far-fetched, to be honest with you.
No, just like if you just follow the news on a daily basis. You pointed out a few things, like start with Kissinger saying you protect Saudi Arabia. Now Saudi Arabia aligned with Russia recently, right? And Saudi Arabia signing massive oil offtake deals with China. there is a shift happening, obviously, and you can't deny those signs. I think like you have to be completely blind to miss those. Like I'm always wondering, like because you and I were both gold bugs. Like I love gold, I love silver. Like what it looks like if we take that perspective away, because we always say it's going to be commodity backed, and if there's a different perspective, I might have to find a good guest for that to discuss that because we're both tainted, right, when it comes to that. And do you think China has enough gold to back, or if the BRICS have enough gold to back a new currency? And when you say commodities, is it just gold and silver backing a new currency, or do you think oil, copper, and maybe even battery metals will be thrown into the mix there?
It's a great question. I'm going to answer it. First of all, let's answer the second question first, and that is that when you look at J.P. Morgan just published a report. Look at China, for example. Now, the London Metals Exchange noted that they saw about a 90% drop last year in zinc inventories, a 75% drop in aluminum inventories. You keep hearing about copper shortages. So listen to what JP Morgan just said. According to JP Morgan, China currently holds 80% of the global copper inventory, 70% of the corn, 51% of global wheat, 46% of global soybeans, 70% of global crude oil, and over 20% of global aluminum inventories. And China is stockpiling every ounce of gold it can get its hands on. So yes, I do think that it's not going to be just about gold and silver. These countries are accumulating assets because they understand what that really means. It's the assets that matter. It's not the debt instruments, and it's the things that you would need. It's a war chest. So yes, they are de-dollarizing. There's no question about that. But at the same time, they're accumulating a plethora of other assets as well. Now, when we talk about the countries that have decided to join BRICS, this is very relevant. I'm going to see if I can find this one little piece that I want to read to you. Okay, here it is. So here are the countries that have decided to join BRICS. There's 13 new ones, and then there's some others. I'm going to get to something that's very, very interesting to your point about gold backing. Now, remember, gold is now a tier one reserve asset, the only other one next to US dollars. Here are the 13 countries that have decided to join BRICS that we know of: Algeria, Argentina, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, Nicaragua, Turkey, Indonesia, Senegal, Nigeria, Afghanistan, Egypt, Kazakhstan, and Saudi Arabia. They're also talking about these countries that have spheres of influence, like Argentina would be next to Brazil. Brazil having the sphere of influence. Argentina is next on the list. You have Nicaragua, you have Algeria, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Nigeria, Senegal, Afghanistan, Kazakhstan, Indonesia, who, by the way, Indonesia's president, Nadudu, I think it is, came out and said that he's calling for an OPEC-style cartel with rare earth metals. The majority of them for battery-powered vehicles are found in Eurasian continent. We haven't thought this one through very well, from the fire to the frying pan, or from the frying pan to the fire, rather, in the respect that, yeah, it's really sounds nice to have clean air and to go green, but to get the battery-powered rare earth metals, the majority of them are over there, and now you got them saying, "Hey, let's do a cartel here." But I want you to think about this. Listen to this. This is gold holdings as a percentage of reserves. Every one of these countries I'm going to read to you is either in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Belt and Road Initiative, or BRICS. Venezuela, 82%. Uzbekistan, 65%. Kazakhstan, 63%. These are a percentage of, this is gold as a percentage of their reserves. Bolivia, 55%. Belarus, 40%. Turkey, who bought more gold than any country in the world last year, 29%. Pakistan, 29%. Kyrgyzstan, 22%. So these countries who have aspirations of moving away from the West are using gold production and accumulation to give them equal footing at the table. When you talk about the BRICS nations, their presidency rotates. This year it's in South Africa. It's a system based upon equal footing. And if you are going to make this work, yeah, you definitely have to pledge something to the system. And what better way to roll out a distributed ledger technology on the heels perhaps of the Chinese digital yuan, which has done 25 billion in successful settlements since before the Winter Olympics in Beijing, than to show what every one of these countries are pledging. Now, when the Russian finance minister in charge of this new currency came out and said it's going to be pegged to a basket of commodities like hydrocarbon and fuel and corn and or sugar or oil or gold, or I mean, he made it seem like it would be a bunch. It's a little bit tougher to figure out unless you're using a distributed ledger technology, showing the veracity, the mutability of it, and maintaining a certain peg or ratio. Certainly, gold and silver would be a whole heck of gold in particular would be a whole heck of a lot easier. And that's what the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is talking about. And all of these countries are either part of the SCO or the BRICS nations. And there will be, I believe, commodities, and in particular gold, tier one, that will be used to pledge to the new system, pegged to a distributed ledger technology. We've already been told by the BIS that every country has to have one by 2025. China and the United Arab Emirates just finished testing their mBridge, which is a way for them to go back and forth between central bank digital currencies, sidestepping the SWIFT system. These pieces are being put into place, and the fact that our Western media doesn't talk about it is a crime. You can see the first step, the first order of business is building your own central bank digital currency that will then allow you through the mBridge technology and others. And we just saw Russia and Iran do it last week with their own technology. These countries can go back and forth with one another between their own currencies, which will be digital, without going through the Western SWIFT system, the intermediary banks. And then once those pieces are in place, then they issue a united currency that they can trade their own back and forth through these vehicles like the mBridge, from the digital BRICS currency or the digital SCO currency to whatever, the digital yuan or the digital ruble or whatever. So they'll all have their own currency, and they will also have a currency that is united with the ability to go back and forth without going through the Western SWIFT system. And the fact that all of these countries are massively accumulating gold, and the central banks in general, and when you talk about the central banks, let's just ignore the Western central banks because they're not doing squat. It's the Eastern central banks that have bought more gold than any time since 1967, the second most in history. Not just gold. India imported 304 million ounces of silver last year. That's 10 times more than is on the registered category of the COMEX market, which is the bars that are available for delivery backing the contracts that are out there. Or you look at what the London Metals Exchange just said, and they said if the silver deliveries are reminiscent this year of what they were last year, there won't be any silver left. This is getting real, and it's being ignored by the mainstream. But if you take a step back and look at what these countries are doing, you know, Rick Rule is one of my friends and an incredibly smart guy. And I listened to what he said and talking about the BRICS, and he said, you know, I don't know that the BRICS will even be a formidable foe, because look at the European Union. These are countries with different belief structures, different histories, different cultures, and it didn't work. And I agree with him. But what will make this work, you see, the rallying cry is going against the homogeny, going against the sanctions, going against the perceived hypocrisy. That's what gets everyone to the table. The pegging of a commodity, or in particular gold, or whatever it turns out to be, to a distributed ledger technology, a system where the presidency rotates. You're talking a system that will work, where everyone has equal footing and equal say at the table, where it's not being dominated by one central player, but equal share, equal footing, equal pledging of an asset to a commodity, maintaining stability in a new system. One hell of a foe, as far as I'm concerned. And when you back the military presence, there was an article today in Zero Hedge, Kai. The same article came out 2 days after Russia signed an agreement with Saudi Arabia for military protection. When I'm screaming in September 2021 that we left Afghanistan like a bunch of idiots, and then there was no coincidence to those announcements and the timing. That day, Russia announced, and they just talked about it again today. Today, they're doing a military exercise, a naval exercise in South Africa with China and Russia. China and Russia's Navy are doing, with the South African Navy, a naval exercise. Now, this is part of the BRICS nations. They're joining together, showing strength in military. But the article in Zero Hedge said the exact same thing it did in 2021, that they are outfitted, I forgot the name of the missile, with their hypersonic ICBMs that go Mach 8. Mach 8, there isn't, it's the fastest missile on the planet, and they are covered in what they call a plasma cloud when they're going so fast that the radars can't even see them, and they hit the ground at the speed of an asteroid. That is their way of saying, and pardon my French, don't F with me. Don't F with us the way that you did Hussein and Gaddafi. They're showing their military strength that way, even if in a conventional war in the Ukraine, they're lacking. The point of it is that it's real. It is becoming real, not only from a standpoint of cross-border payments or accumulating commodities, but military strength. Do you want to mess with China and Russia? If you start to mess with Saudi Arabia, who joined the BRICS nations, and the loss of the petro status, do you really want to go to war with that group? And I think this is what will make it work. A strong military, a much bigger GDP, equal footing at the table, pledging commodities, a rotating presidency, a system denominated by transparency, a la the new distributed ledger technology, showing what is pegged, and the fact that these countries are accumulating copious amounts of commodities, not just gold and silver, everything like China is doing. That is what will make the system work. And the fact that we are focused on ESG and woke and flying balloons, we're missing the point altogether. And I don't know, Kai, I think this is the most real it's ever been. I think we're getting very close to the rubber touching the road, if you will.
Absolutely. It was my next and final question to sort of wrap up part one of our conversation was really timeline as well. Because when I look at, and you had that slide up on your presentation at VRIC, whenever there was a change in world reserve currency, there was always a war associated with it, right? Like the British taking over because they had the strongest naval fleet, the US taking over because they won the World War, they pretty much won World War II in combination with the Brits. So I'm kind of scared, for the next few years here. And you're saying there's a lot of saber rattling going on, and eventually this will boil over.
Well, what we just heard last week, Sunday, that the U.S. State Department has advised all Americans, either traveling or living in Russia, to get out now. I mean, what the hell does that mean? When I think about this as a homicide, right? And I pay you, I give you money and weaponry, and I give you money, I give you the gun, and I tell you, I provide support on where this person is going to be, intelligence. We've given $100 billion to the Ukraine. We give them Stinger missiles and drones, and now tanks, and now they want our F-16s, and then we provide intelligence on where to fire those missiles and drones, and where to deploy those tanks. Does that not make us a co-conspirator? Does that not make us an accomplice? As far as I'm concerned, it's an act of war. And the fact that our politicians are doing this is absolutely insane. As far as I'm concerned, we have no business being in this war. Just as an aside, Janet Yellen told us a few weeks ago that the U.S. has to go to extraordinary measures to raise the debt ceiling, right? Because we keep raising the debt ceiling because we're an insolvent country. And those extraordinary measures, which most people aren't aware of, it's really gross. You have to dig to find it. I found a Yahoo Finance article that said she borrowed from the Postal Retirement Fund, the Civil Servants Retirement Fund, and the Disabled Veterans Retirement Fund to get money to raise the debt ceiling. Enough to make you want to throw up, stealing from postal workers, civil servants, and disabled veterans. Of course, they'll pay it back. But the grossest part about that article was the article directly after it. So we borrow money to raise the debt ceiling because we're broke, stealing from people who've given their life to service. And the next article says that they just voted to give another $45 billion to the Ukraine. So we're broke. We have an omnibus bill of $1.75 trillion that says in it that we cannot use any of it, earmark any of it for border security. Yet in it, $475 million goes to security for Lebanon, Oman, and Jordan. I mean, you can't make up the stupidity of what we are doing, and we are poking the bear. And as far as I'm concerned, you could not draw up a more inappropriate response to world events than our leaders, current leaders, are doing. And you're right, it's frightening. And when you see the State Department tell all Americans to get out of Russia now, this was on Sunday, are we close to World War III? God help us if so. I hope not. But we start going after Crimea. There's going to be, I think, a lot more to talk about in terms of how close are we to World War III.
There's something happened a couple of weeks ago where I thought, okay, this was the same event that triggered World War One when the Habsburg prince was killed in Sarajevo. Sort of, I think it was a shooting down of the helicopter in the Ukraine that had I want to say Foreign Affairs Minister of the Ukraine on it, or the Minister of the Interior. I'm confusing facts here, but that sort of was the trigger through the proxy war, because Germany got pulled in because the Habsburg prince was killed in Sarajevo in World War One, and then we had to come in and fight, and sort of triggered it all. So I'm kind of worried about those events when I see it, and watching it very closely. Andy, let's wrap up part one here, because part two we're going to talk about how to sort of protect yourself from the Great Reset, or how to go into the Great Reset and protecting yourself. We want to talk more gold and silver in part two. Really, really appreciate your time right now. And to everybody else, thank you so much for tuning in. Subscribe to the channel. We're going to post part two here in a couple days as well, so make sure to subscribe. Leave a comment. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is your personal timeline of how things will play out? Personally, like just talking with Andy, I'm scared shitless again about world events, because I think shit is going to hit the fan very, very soon. And some of our other guests at the CBDCs and other events will happen this summer. So I'm watching this very closely, and just be critical. Check the news, check the facts, leave a comment, leave a like. We'll be back with lots more in a minute.